The overarching goal of this modernisation strategy is to improve the efficiency and capacity, importantly, of the airspace. More planes, effectively. Industry has ambitions of growth of 75% by 2050. Currently, we've got around 6,000 flights a day in UK airspace. So you're adding another 4,500 to that.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Walmer, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, what are we covering today?
Hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. We have two cracking interviews for our listeners in this episode of Calling All Stations, the Transport Podcast. We're going to hear a little later from Chris Jackson, who's the Managing Director of TransPennine Express, the railway company operating across the north of England and Scotland, explaining to you how the company has managed to recently to restore its full timetable of services across the region. But before that, we're going to take to the air and hear your interview with Paul Beckford, who runs HACAN, the residents and community organisation that responds to aircraft noise around Heathrow in West London and the surrounding counties, who's been talking to you about the reorganisation of flight paths across the southeast of England and how this will bring possible benefits to some residents, but challenges to others.
Aviation is a controversial issue, but one of the aspects that is rarely talked about are flight paths. And apparently there is a review of flight paths over the UK. And I thought, who best to find out more about this and the implication of this, but Paul Beckford of HACAN, which is the Heathrow campaign against third runway, but also campaigns on a lot of other local issues around Heathrow. So, Paul, thank you very much for coming on Calling All Stations. And perhaps you might have to start by explaining to our listeners exactly how the flight path system works at the moment, and then what the changes are that are being proposed.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me on, Christian. It's a real pleasure to join the podcast. And so Paul Beckford from HACAN. So we have been around in various forms since the 70s, and they representing the people of the communities underneath the flight paths at Heathrow. And yes, you're right. We are about to undergo the biggest change in UK airspace history since the invention of the aircraft, I suppose.
And nobody has heard about this. This has just had virtually zero publicity.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So we're about to basically shift away from the use of radar technology. So you've got radars on the ground, effectively, that help aircraft to navigate through the airspace, into effectively a Satnav. We're going to be using satellite technology. So like a Satnav you have in your car, that's what we're going to move towards for aviation. It's a complicated process. As you can imagine, it started out with the Airspace Modernisation strategy, which was officially published in 2018, and work began to get underway. But obviously the pandemic put paid to some of the progress there. But effectively what we're seeing is the redesign of the entirety of the airspace over the UK. So wow. 22 airports are involved, well, maybe 21, because Cardiff have just dropped out because they've run out of money to do it. But we've given so far about £10 million of taxpayers' money to the industry to help them develop this. And there's rumoured to be that they need another 30, 40 million maybe to get the job done. The time scale was already slipped by a couple of years as well, because you're trying to coordinate all of these different airports. So each airport in the UK that are partaking have to redesign their own flight paths, both arrivals and departures. And then they have to coordinate that with other airports around it. So you can imagine London is a very congested area in terms of airspace. There's 6 major airports plus RAF ones and smaller ones like Biggin Hill. And the government, in its wisdom, set up something called the Airspace Change Organisation Group, ACOG, and their job is to create the master plan for which all these airports feed in their own individual plans into a system where we get some sort of overarching plan that shows how we can deliver airspace change.
Wow. So that is some agenda, isn't it?
It's massive. It's huge for each of the airports. Obviously, there's only so many like airspace consultants out there in the marketplace. So some of these people are working for multiple airports. It's fiendishly complicated. You know, Heathrow has 1,300 arrivals and departures every day. You've got 6 departure routes and arrival routes off each runway. So there's 2 runways, 4 ends. So you could start with hundreds of thousands of options. In the current phase they've whittled it down to about 160, I think. But yeah, that's before they get ready to do any serious design work, really. So
what's the basic plan to kind of simplify the way that planes fly in the air? I mean, what's the actual what's that aim?
The overarching goal of this modernisation strategy is to improve the efficiency and capacity, importantly, of the airspace, because more planes effectively. You know, industry has ambitions of growth of 75% by 2050. Currently we've got around 6,000 flights a day in UK airspace, so you know you're adding another 4,500 to that if the industry gets its way and its ambitions, and you can't do that without changing the airspace. You know, we're flying on 70-year-old technology. I'm not a Luddite, neither of our members. We recognise progress has to happen. I think the concern comes is where the purported benefits, and there will be some benefits of this process, absolutely, but whether they're going to be equally shared between industry and communities that are impacted is far from clear. And when the overarching goal of the program is to deliver extra capacity, you can understand why local communities will be slightly concerned about that impact will be for them.
So what are you trying to? Well, yeah, how are you trying to channel this effort then?
Well, there's a couple of things. One, the other thing that the program is going to do is, as part of the technological change, you're going to have a process called performance-based navigation. It's called PBN for short. And this is basically where you can fly planes closer together. You can fly them down a narrower path because you've got better information on the accuracy of where they are in the position in the sky. So you can fly them closer together more safely. All of which sounds great because that's great for an airport. You can get the aircraft down and use your asset more efficiently. However, everywhere in the world where PBN has been introduced on a large scale, particularly the States, there's been a huge backlash from overflown communities. So much so that in the US, there's now a Quieter Skies caucus been formed in Congress because of the huge changes that have happened.
Why? Because this would result in more planes directly over a particular spot.
Yes, and even though they're redesigning the flight paths and that there's some benefit there, we might be able to get rid of the stacks where the aircraft are queuing up. You know, when sometimes you land in London, you'll fly around a couple of times before you actually land. So you could elongate those stacks. So instead of sort of a whirlpool, they'll go out in a large S formation, and that should reduce emissions. It should make the improve journey times where there's going to be benefits to the passengers, absolutely, and potentially benefits in terms of reducing emissions and reducing noise for communities underneath those stacks. However, once you get into the final approach path, so the last sort of 7 miles or so, nautical miles, those flight paths for safety reasons are locked in. So your communities in east and west of Heathrow, in Chiswick, in Hammersmith, in Richmond, Windsor, Slough, there's only so much tinkering that can be done with the flight path design before they have to lock in for safety reasons, which means that there is a risk that those communities will be hammered by noise on a more consistent basis.
Right. So what's the next stage with this, and how are you trying to have an input?
So each of the airports obviously are at slightly different phases of it. Heathrow were quite far advanced when pre-pandemic, when they were going gung-ho for the 3rd runway. But since that's now on the back burner, at least officially, they had to restart their whole process and start again. So they have just passed stage 2B in the CAA's CAP 1616 gateway, which is the document that governs the processes that they have to go through in order to get an airspace change approved. And they're entering into stage 3, which is where all the really heavy lifting is going to be done on design work, impact assessment, both from an environmental health perspective as well. And we're trying to influence it by number one big priority for our members is making sure that periods of respite are maintained. So where at the moment at Heathrow, you have runway alternation where the planes switch runways they're landing and taking off from. And that's really, really valuable. And Heathrow, to their credit, have got one of the design principles in their program around maintaining meaningful respite. The word meaningful is quite important because various studies have shown that a 3 decibel decrease has no impact to people on the ground. So you really need around 9 decibel change in the noise environment for people to notice it and to get sort of health benefits. Quite how that's reconciled with the ambitions to grow the number of planes going down certain routes is yet to be ascertained. But we're trying to keep that pressure on. And I mentioned health earlier on because we don't really have a baseline. We know noise impacts millions of people. We know the health impacts of noise continually are proven to be occurring at lower levels than previously were thought, and having all sorts of issues, both in cardiovascular disease, but also cognitive development in children.
Wow.
But we don't have a sort of baseline where we say, okay, this number of people are impacted at Heathrow currently in terms of, we know in a noise contour, but that's not the same as the health impact. So we don't know what the changes that come, whether how negative or positive that may be. So one of the big things we've been pushing for is to get that built into the program, because I fear if we miss this opportunity to try and influence and get that assessment done now, we're not going to have another chance to do it. And then you're not going to have the information on which policymakers can make informed decisions.
Will this new system be introduced airport by airport, or will it be one big bang?
It's going to be one big bang, I believe.
Wow.
Well, some airports, so they've split the 21 airports, 22 airports have been split into 3 zones. You've got Scotland, then you've got the South, which includes London, and then you've got like the North and sort of Midlands. So they have split, and so it's not clear whether Scotland might go first because they're the most advanced in the programme. So you could do part of the airspace change like that. But from my perspective at Heathrow, they're coordinating all the London airports because they have to, because anything that Heathrow does has an impact at Luton, Stansted, Gatwick. For example, there's areas now in North London where planes landing at Luton are kept low because they have to keep out of the way of aircraft coming from Heathrow. But that then obviously has a negative impact for those communities around Luton. So there is now ACOG, who I mentioned earlier on, have been tasked with looking at the coordination of this. But DFT and CAA now recognise that there needs to be something else. So they're now looking at creating a single design entity specifically for the London region because of how complex it is in coordinating those different impacts and changes. That hasn't been established yet. That was supposed to, it was approved, I think, by the previous minister back in the spring. As something that should be done, and they need to do a public consultation on that. Now, obviously, with a new government in charge, that has to be as part of the review of any policies that they're looking at, and there'll be inevitable delay.
So there's no real time scale for this, or is there an estimated time scale?
2029 is the best estimate, and bear in mind it was originally 2027, so it's already slipped 2 years. I can see it slipping further because I don't think the airports will be in a place to advance their plans the way they want to, and particularly just from Heathrow, because I know it better, that the complexity of what they have to do is so vast that this design phase they're in now in stage 3 could take them 3 years before they're even ready to go to public consultation and say, here's what we'd like to do. And then obviously they've got to come back, take the public feedback on board, try and redesign it again before final approval.
Does this have an impact on the argument for a third runway? Because if they can have more planes coming into the existing 2 runways, then there's less need for a third one.
Yes, it does, because I think they need to do some reconfiguration of how the airport operates on the ground to assist with that. But theoretically, you could probably get another 60,000 flights a year at Heathrow on 2 runways if you're able to design it properly with the airspace. However, the big obstacle to that would be the planning cap that was put in place at the T5 planning inquiry, of 480,000 movements a year. So they would have to apply to Hillingdon Council to get that lifted, and ultimately that would get called in by the Secretary of State. And obviously we would be vehemently opposed to that. But you can see from their commercial perspective why that would make sense, because you could get some increase in capacity at far less expense than a third runway, which was estimated at £20 billion before the pandemic's probably double that now. So it does have a massive impact. Interesting though, Christian, they've in the designs that they've done so far, although they've been quite cute in using swaths of flight paths rather than sort of specific lines, so as not to alarm anybody that's bought a house specifically away from a flight path. There's sort of this gap in the northwest of the airport where a third runway might conveniently be located, where there doesn't seem to be as many swaths going through at the moment. Now, maybe I'm too cynical for my own good, but there is a certain suspicion that they would love to get that in at some point. But I think even their CEOs now said it's 10, 15 years away from any. At which point, you're
starting.
up against,
yes.
even starting, and then at which point you're up against massive, pressure to reduce our carbon impact. So why would anybody want to invest in a project like that?
Yeah, I mean, as a last point, I mean, you started off by saying, oh, they want to increase flights by 75%. But there is a little matter of the kind of sustainability targets about
Absolutely.
that. We've before on the podcast, we've had people about talking about alternative fuels and the like, and really that seems very, very long shot and unlikely. So, I mean, is that at all sustainable?
Not in my view. I listened to that episode. It was a good one. You had some good guests on. I think that there are technologies being developed where, and I don't underestimate the power of the industry to deliver, but it's not delivered on the promises it's made in the last 25 years in terms of reducing its impact. And also you have to, aircraft are hugely expensive assets. Aircraft coming into date now are going to be flying in 2050. So, so again, this is the point about the sort of, with airspace modernisation and with these fuels and alternative fuel technologies, it's not going to be right. Boom, day one they can all start operating, and all of a sudden you're flying on a zero emission aircraft.
Yes.
And some electric aircraft absolutely possible for short haul. I think the hydrogen is viable potentially in the long run, but again, they were looking at 2035, 40 before even the first of those come into commercial
existence. Hydrogen didn't do very well in airships.
It didn't. Well, I also always do wonder about, you've got to freeze it to like minus 250 degrees, and then it's all the associated infrastructure, and why should, and then also a strategic industrial question of whether aviation should get hydrogen as opposed to manufacturing or chemical processing or some other part of the economy. But they're not going to solve the carbon problem. So, I've always been a strong advocate. I think we should have some limits on growth aspirations here until the technology comes. There's no good saying, well, let's grow and we'll worry about it in the future. You can't do that with carbon and the climate. You have to be a bit more strategic. And so what we need to do, stop the growth until we get to the right point.
Absolutely. So as a last point then, is there anything people can do who are worried about this at this stage, or the consultation hasn't really started yet?
It hasn't, but no, I would encourage people to get involved. Obviously, join HACAN is obviously the number one thing people should do. Reach out to us. Let me get you in touch with information or other groups in your area if there's one near your neighbourhood, your airport. Sorry, and also to try and get involved in some of the airport works themselves. So at Heathrow, they have a airspace noise community forum. Other airports have similar forums, and that gives you the opportunity to both hear directly from the airport, but also to raise your concerns with them. I think those who are really interested should follow that route as a first step in engaging. And I'm very happy to have any conversations with people as well. So please do reach out.
Okay, well, Paul, that was really excellent. Thank you for explaining very complicated technicalities, and I hope you get lots of good feedback from this podcast. So thank you very much for coming on Calling All Stations.
Thank you.
I'm with Chris Jackson, the Managing Director of TransPennine Express, and he's called a press conference to announce certain improvements to the timetable and reverting back to the normal timetable in December. So, Chris, what went wrong? Why did you have to initially cut back on the number of trains?
Good question, and thank you for having me on your podcast, Christian. So if you remember 14 months ago, or 14 and a half months ago, the old TransPennine Express ceased to exist. It came under public ownership and therefore under
the operator of last resort.
The operator of last resort, yes. So we are one of four currently under the DOHL banner, along with South Eastern, Northern and LNER, of course. And of course, it was really, really important that when I first came in, I was able to get across the issues, understand them, and develop a plan to fix them. One of the things that I found out very, very quickly was that there was a big backlog of driver training and that the business was very, very complicated. And of course, we had very restrictive driver terms and conditions as well. The driver training backlog was probably the biggest point that I needed to address quickly. And I quickly identified that we needed to give ourselves some headroom to allow us to get through that driver training backlog. And the only way to do that solidly was to temporarily reduce the timetable in December 2023, which we have done. That in turn as well has also allowed us to offer a much more stable and resilient timetable and performance for our customers, and they're flocking back as a result. But it's also allowed us to use 2024 to clear the driver training backlog, and we are well on track. And
so what did you cut back? What?
Yeah, so essentially we were running around, before December 2023, we were running around 325 services per day. We stepped it back to around 300 services per day. And at its core, we reduced the Leeds to Manchester off-peak from 4 trains an hour to 3 trains per hour. But I'm pleased to say that driver training has been progressing really, really well, thanks to the cooperation of drivers, but also cooperation of ASLEF. We've got a rest day working agreement which allows us to clear that training backlog even more quickly, and we're going to reinstate our timetable in December.
But that's a temporary rest day working agreement.
Well, we've got a rest day working agreement that expires March 2025. So, of course, we do need that rest day working agreement to clear the remaining backlog of training, and there will be a residual amount going into 2025. But I'm confident that we will maintain that, we'll continue the good progress, and that, of course, will allow us to introduce that timetable in December, which I committed to stakeholders several months ago, and indeed we're able to deliver on that.
So under that agreement, they were required to work certain rest days, is that right?
No one's required to do anything, but of course what the agreement allows drivers to do, if they opt in to the rest day working agreement, they can work their rest days at an agreed rate, a premium rate of course, to either cover the train service or indeed to work their rest days to train on routes or train on traction to clear the backlog.
And previously they would not have been able to do that?
No, this is the thing with the rest day working agreements in the industry. It requires cooperation of drivers and therefore by default of ASLEF, and it requires a bespoke agreement between the business, in this case TransPennine Express, and ASLEF to allow their drivers or drivers to work or their members to work rest days.
Right,
and that's
you didn't have that before?
To be fair to the previous business, there was an agreement, a rest day working agreement. It was on the shelf. Right. There just wasn't the relationship between ASLEF and TransPennine Express to allow that agreement to be switched on. Okay. With the reset in relationships that I think the transfer to the public sector allowed, back in June of last year, we were able to switch that rest day working agreement on quite quickly, around a couple of weeks after we came in.
And you also had some rolling stock issues?
We had some, in what sense? What do you mean by that?
Well, you had some rolling stock that you couldn't use, basically.
Yeah, you're quite correct, yes. That's the issue that I mentioned earlier about the business being very, very complicated. We're only a relatively small TOC, train operating company, when you consider against others nationally. And we had 4 different types of traction. That was proving to be very difficult to train drivers and conductors on, but crucially to maintain competence. And because the Class 68s and the Mark 5s, which is the trains that we're talking about, because we couldn't operate them very frequently in traffic and for long durations, lots of what I'd considered to be small little faults kept on manifesting themselves, and ultimately it resulted in a very poor offering for customers. So either customers had a train that was faulty or had a train that couldn't operate because it didn't have a driver or conductor.
These were not very old trains, were they?
They weren't very old trains, no. So it was a bold and difficult decision actually to decide to terminate their lease. Their lease was up this year. And indeed, we do have a few of them at Longsight down the road that are just in the final stages of their handback. But I maintain that it was a difficult decision, but it absolutely was the right one, because as soon as we got rid of those trains, as soon as we temporarily stepped back the timetable, we have seen cancellations reduced by 50%. Passenger growth is growing at 11% year on year. Customer satisfaction scores at the highest levels they've ever been, and customer complaints at the lowest. So the plans that we put in place have allowed more services to operate, which means more seats have been available, much more predictable, reliable service, and people are coming back to TransPennine Express.
Now, apparently you're back up to 25 million passengers a year you're expecting, but that's still not back to pre-COVID levels.
Still not back to pre-COVID levels. 70% of our passengers are leisure. But you're right, we're predicting to carry 25 million passengers this year. But when we...
And pre-COVID it was 27.
27 million, yes. So, but do you know what? I think the growth potential in this business, the latent growth, is really, really exciting. It's a really exciting place to be. And when we introduce our December timetable, restore those services that we temporarily removed, it's a 12% increase in the number of seats, or around 1,300 extra seats per day that we will be able to offer to customers. And I'm convinced that we'll be able to to fill those seats and sell those tickets.
Right, now you've also, in the offering, you've got some new rolling stock, possibly.
Yes, and that is really exciting. So we are in the market for 29 brand new trains. That's out at ITN, Invitation to Negotiate stage. So we're expecting to get some of those bids back later this year for us to evaluate. And of course, that rolling stock will allow us to make best use of the massive infrastructure investment programme, which is the TransPennine route upgrade. If you go between Manchester and York now, it looks like one giant building site. A phenomenal amount of work and investment is going in. They're going to electrify the line. Line speeds are going to be increased. Lots of new infrastructure is going in. And those new trains, of course, will be able to offer a much more frequent and faster service between the great cities and towns of the north.
But in the short term, it's going to be some disruption.
Yes, and we need to be quite transparent about that. But even, this is what I tend to rationalise in my mind, even with this year, we've had around 100, well, we will have 140 days of disruption where customers will travel on a diversionary route away from the normal core TransPennine network. That's why we've been focusing so much on maintaining competency of drivers and conductors on diversionary routes so we can keep passengers' bottoms on train seats rather than bus seats wherever we can.
So it's generally not cancellations, but actually diversionary routes.
Lots of diversions this year, yeah. And do you know what? It will be 150 to 160 days per year between now and the end of the decade.
Gosh, every other day almost.
Well, yes, it will be in blocks, so not every other day. But of course, we've got an army of planners and resource to support our customers through those through that disruption. But we will operate services via diversionary routes and keep passengers' bottoms on train seats rather than bus seats wherever we possibly can. But even with those diversions that we've seen this year, we're still growing at 11% year on year. So we know that that growth will come back. And whilst it may be slightly suppressed until the full TI TransPennine route upgrade programme is completed, I'm really excited about what it will mean when the new trains come in.
Who do you think these passengers coming back are? I mean, you said they're mainly leisure, are they?
Mainly leisure. 70% of our market is leisure, but of course we do have commuter and we do have business. Business isn't as strong, certainly as it was pre-COVID, but we know that people's working patterns have changed. But we are trying to reach out and attract them back. And one of the things, of course, that we've done on the West Coast main line is introduce West Coast Kitchen, which is a new first-class dining experience, but also a dedicated host for standard class.
Go on, tell me about that. So what's that?
So, of course, I think catering is always a bit of a question mark in the industry about whether catering actually makes any money. My view is that if you're travelling a long distance, of which our customers are between Manchester, Liverpool and Glasgow and Edinburgh, they deserve a premium service. So we do offer a hot food meal and menu on our West Coast services, and we also have a dedicated...
For all passengers, not just first class?
For first class for the hot food, but also standard class we have a dedicated trolley service available. Previously, there was one customer host on board that train who had to look after first class customers and standard class customers, and our customers were telling us that our first class offer was inferior to Avanti and just not cutting the mustard. So we decided that we were going to do something different. We've recruited via our partners Rail Gourmet 30 additional heads who are now operating on the West Coast main line. We are getting some fantastic customer feedback, and if it's a success, which the early stats suggest that it is, it's at break even already. We think it actually is generative. We're looking to roll that out on other parts of the TransPennine network in early
on the longer trains, so
and
journeys of a couple of hours or something.
If we can make the case, and we think that it's an ideal fit for our Liverpool to Newcastle service group, which uses Hitachi 802 units. That's our premium service. It's quite a long journey time, and we think that there's a market for that as well.
Right. And something else we were discussing earlier, you said that you're thinking of improving something that is dear to my heart about Wi-Fi on trains. And you think you could improve that offering. How would that work?
Well, I've learned a lot about Wi-Fi, as I'm sure you have when you're writing
your
article.
I have been researching it, yes.
And I learned a lot about it as a paper crossed my desk, and we discussed it as a director team. Currently, we have a cap on our Wi-Fi, which is perhaps one of the reasons why customers are telling us that our Wi-Fi is pretty poor.
Yes, and that's the cap, as I discovered, is to stop people downloading kind of major things or even having Teams or Zoom conversations, and it doesn't enable you to do that. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's a false cap. It's a cap imposed by the TOC, not a cap by the technology.
It's a cap imposed by the TOC.
Yes.
Yeah, quite correct. And when going back to what you asked before about how do you attract different markets back to rail, business is one of them. We think that if we were to be bold and did something with the cap, either increase it or scrap it completely, I think that could be a big selling point and could attract more business travellers back to rail. So whilst we've not made a final decision on whether we will scrap the cap or increase the cap, I'm certainly very keen to explore it, and you'll hear more about that soon.
And you think that actually that might pay for itself in terms of improvement?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you can crunch the numbers and you can, put whatever slant on the numbers that you want. Our belief at TransPennine Express is that it could indeed be generative if the cap was removed. However, we do need to go through various discussions with funders and others as it stands at the moment, because there is a level of scepticism about whether it is indeed generative. We think it is. We'd be keen to do a trial, and I'd like to share more about that with you soon.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Chris. That's a great kind of rundown of improvements you're making and hoping to make. And, I hope that all this bears fruit.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
Here's Christian's final thought from the departure lounge.
Well, I hope this is the last time, at least for a while, that I'm going to have to cover industrial action in the rail industry, because for the past 2 years, there's been an ongoing dispute. And my solution always was that the pay deal needed to be separated out from discussions about terms and conditions and practices that the operators saw as inefficient. And it took the election and the arrival of a new transport team in the Department for Transport to actually do precisely that. So they agreed a pay deal, and the unions have now accepted that, or are putting it out to their members. ASLEF is putting it out to its members, and we hope that will be at least the end of this national dispute. Now, there are still issues to be resolved, as demonstrated by the fact that there is apparently some problems on LNER, and there is a kind of threat of strike action there. But overall, the situation should be, industrial relations on the railways should be much better, and that will have a big impact on passengers' satisfaction, and hopefully will help bring numbers back to the railways.
Calling All Stations, the transport podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do also follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle is @AllStationsPod.